All right, welcome back to another episode of Bear's Guide to a 5. This time we are going to tackle the Unit 6 AP Human review. Now, this is going to have an immense amount of stuff in it. It's over 3 different topics: development, industry, and urbanization, maybe? I forget. We'll get through it. It's all in here. Yeah, we're all in for a ride. You're going to be able to get everything you need from this. So let's get into. So first, what we have to talk about is development before we talk about anything else. And this is a topic we've talked a whole lot about this year. This is one of the main concepts of the class, this Human Development Index. And how do we develop countries, right? Well, first, if we were going to ask the question, how do we develop countries, we have to know how we measure development in countries, and that is with the HDI, looking at the standard of living. How much money on average are people making in these countries? What is the life expectancy, and how that reflects access to healthcare? And then finally, access to knowledge, the literacy rate. And we know this is a 0 to 1 measurement. And this is the Human Development Index ratings for the world on a choropleth map, so we know it's not the most honest when we're looking at data, but typical trends around the world that you should know. Now, this is just ranking HDI along a 0 to 1 graph, looking at each region. And you should be able to you don't need to remember the numbers for each region, but you should know relatively where each region is on this HDI chart. Now, the first thing that's in HDI is this productivity, or the standard of living, or how much money on average people make. And here's all these different measurements for how we measure the productivity or how much money a country makes. Now, do you want to remember all of them and memorize each vocab word? Sure, go ahead. But I can't. I have a hard time with that. So I wouldn't expect the same from you. What I would expect, though, is to understand that these are all measurements of productivity, and this is what we use to measure part of our development when we're talking about countries. And if we take any of these numbers and divide it by people, we call that per capita, right? So we're measuring it based on per people in the country. But there are some problems with GDP or GNI per capita or whatever other acronym you want to use, is that when you divide it by the amount of people, you're not actually getting a really honest number for how much money people are making, right? Because if we take the GDP of the United States and we turn it into GDP per capita, it's 50,000 per person, and not every person in this country makes $50,000. It's the idea that everybody on average could make about $50,000. So what's good about GDP per capita is that it helps us compare the well-being to other countries. Now, how countries make money is based on this idea of employment sectors, right? So we have we have 5 different sectors, but primary, extracting materials from the earth; secondary, turning those raw materials into a finished good; tertiary, taking that finished product and selling it; and then quaternary and quinary. Quaternary is the manipulation of information. These are really high skill jobs: research, teaching, even selling information. Well, no, we'll keep that in tertiary. And then quinary are your really high level decision making people that there's just not a lot of these jobs. But of course, you have the informal sector, people that work quote unquote under the table or for cash. So we can't put them into any of these because the government does not collect taxes from them. And if the government doesn't collect taxes from them, that means they can't use it to build infrastructure and stuff like that. And then we have this little pyramid where you could see this breakdown of like who has the most jobs in the world. But we know from the agriculture unit that primary jobs take up a majority of the world jobs. But it's not just farming, it is mining, fishing, drilling, anything that extracts from the environment. So our second component is health. Remember, life expectancy, but what we're really looking at is access to healthcare, right? That is the biggest thing. You never want to put on an FRQ like that places don't have medicine or that they haven't discovered medicine. It's ignorant at this point. Everybody in the world knows about medicine. Everybody has the ability to find or knows of modern medicine. The question is, do they have access to that healthcare? Are they living in a rural area without, infrastructure to get to an urban area to get to these services? Are they in a squatter settlement with no money and can't afford healthcare in countries? Like, that is the real question, not do they know about medicine? Everybody knows about medicine. It's, do they have the access to that medicine? And finally, our third component of HDI is access to knowledge, or those literacy rates, which is really straightforward. But when we find that obviously not every place has, so if for example in the US, if the HDI number is 0.85, does everybody in the US get to experience that 0.85 of Human Development Index? No, because not everybody in the country is having the same experience, and that's why we have the inequality adjusted HDI. We can find out what inequality exists in a country. Now, it's a really complicated formula that are used by geographers to figure out the IHDI. So instead, we'll just think about the concept, right? What we know is the IHDI shows us the inequality, and the IHDI will always be lower than the HDI. And the goal is to not have a difference. The goal is to have your IHDI match your HDI, which means that you don't have any inequality. But the IHDI will never, ever be higher than the HDI. Okay, and then we get to GDI. So we want to focus on the gender-related development index. Now we're focusing on women. We're taking the same exact measures of HDI, but we're only applying it to women. And then we can take this GDI and then compare the GI to the HDI. But remember, HDI is men and women. So there's no way for us to compare women to men because we don't measure the development of just men. But if we wanted to get a little bit more in detail about the development of women, we could look at the Gender Inequality Index. Now, unlike HDI and IHDI, we want to get closer to 0 on this one. It's still 0 to 1, but you don't want more inequality. You want to lessen the amount of inequality. You want to lessen it as much as possible. And why do we focus on women? Because women are the key to development, right? Men have always had access to the keys of development. They've always been able to go get paid jobs. They've always been able to go get an education. They've always been able to be involved in politics, right? Medicine has always been for men. So when we look at the Gender Inequality Index, we're looking at women because they're the ones that have been targeted for not going to school or not having the ability to have a paid job. So they're really the keys to development, because if we get more women involved in all of these other sectors, then countries can grow. So what are we looking at primarily? Right, what does the GII represent? Reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market. Remember, these are things that only affect women. Men have never had to figure out their reproductive health. They've never had to wonder, will I die giving childbirth? Because men do not experience childbirth. So that cannot affect us, and this is why we measure this for women. Where empowerment, how many government seats are held in government by women? And what are the secondary education rates? Men have never been barred from the institutions of government, ever, in the existence of history. This is why we measure this with women, because they have. And finally, labor market. Why would we measure the amount of women in the paid labor force? Because at one point in time, women weren't allowed in the paid labor force, but that has never affected men. So once again, really easy way to remember the GII, because it's things that only affect women. And then if we were to ask the question, what's the correlation between HDI and GII? Shockingly, the higher your HDI number, the lower inequality you have. What a thought. So why isn't the U.S. equal? So it's good to know that for the AP exam, because we do have to be critical of the United States, as a majority of us live here, and most likely to come up on the exam. We are a developed nation, but, excuse me, we are lacking behind the other the rest of the developed world. When it comes to HDI, we're 15th. That may have changed in the last couple years, but not by a whole lot. 42nd in GII, once again, that could have changed, but not by a whole lot. And that really comes from the higher birth rates amongst teens. We have a higher maternal mortality rate amongst women in childbirth, especially women of color. And we know that our government body just does not have a lot of women involved in it compared to the rest of the developed world. And here you can see that we have this chart of U.S. teen births high comparatively to other countries, right? And reasons for high teen birth pregnancy in the U.S. versus the rest of the developed world: less favorable socioeconomic conditions. We have lower levels of education with some groups in the United States. We know that lower income levels leads to teenage families, lack of access to contraceptive, or a cultural stigma talking about contraceptive use, which it's interesting. All of these things seem like they're affecting the developing world. These are things that we talked about in the developing world: not having enough money, not having contraceptives, or the cultural stigma, the taboo of using them. But we're still experiencing these same exact things in the developed world. And then here's the reasons for the maternal mortality rate. And we know that women in this country, especially women of color, have a disproportionate rate of experiencing mortality or death during childbirth. And that is something unique to the United States. And then finally, our involvement with women in government, not doing so well, according to this chart. And then this is just a chart of women in the paid labor force, further proving the point that we have this wage gap that exists, that women aren't involved in the paid labor force as much as they should be, so on and so forth. But what are the solutions to these things, to development? And before we get into development, just talking about how to improve the lives of women, because remember, we have to figure out solutions to get women more involved, and we know that is breaking the traditional roles that women have. Well, it's not like they can just go and start businesses or go and get a job or go and do whatever, right? They are restricted to their lives. So one way that the rest of the world has helped women develop in the developing world are microloans, microcredit, or microfinance. Basically, it's this idea that from the developed world, they loan a small amount of money to the developing world. It improves their lives. You research, obviously, what they're doing first, making sure that it's a good business model, that they can make the money back, that they understand the point of the loan. And it is actually very successful in making sure that women in the developing world can start their businesses, start making some money, have better access to education, maybe send their kids to school, and get out of these traditional roles. But now that takes us to development overall. And in this unit, we talked about some developmental theories or ideas. How do countries actually develop? How do they go about, because we've talked about this concept of development and we've talked about what development looks like, but how do they actually do it, right? And one of the ways that you could do it is this idea of Rostow's 5 stages of development. Now, I'm not going to go through each stage because you can go back and look at any of my videos that explain this concept, or go back and look in your notes. But understand that the 5 steps, this is one of the development theories that we talk about that really focus on this idea of a country being able to internationally trade, and that from that one export, they're able to take that money and put it into other ways of making money for that country, whether it be in the primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector, ultimately more in the tertiary sector. But the idea is to trade something with the world, to cultivate a whole bunch of money, and then use that money to build up the rest of your economy and eventually become a developed nation. Now, examples of this, just have a breakdown of stages 1 through 5. You can look at these, and you could categorize the world today in these different stages. Not so much anybody in stage 1, but we could definitely point out what countries are in stage 3, 4, and 5. Now, here's just another map of developed regions versus underdeveloped regions or developing regions. And one of the successes of Rostow's model, one of these countries, or a set of countries that went through this process of Rostow's model to develop, are the 4 Asian dragons: Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea. They used low-wage labor as their economic asset, traded it to the world, making textiles and small electronics for people. Over time, they shifted to not only making electronics, but designing electronics. And now they solely design these electronics, and even they're made in other countries. But there are some issues with Rostow's model. It's not so easy, these 5 easy steps to become a developed nation. What about these resources, markets, and the other countries? The fact is that there are issues. What if your country doesn't have a resource it can trade? What if the markets don't want to buy your product? What if the markets want to exploit the developing world? Or why are we assuming that all countries can develop, because that's just not sustainable? And then finally, the biggest problem is that they can't raise the wages in stage 3 of Rostow's model, so they can't take that money and spread it to other sectors of employment, and thus they get stuck in stage 3, permanently exporting goods to the developed world. So our next development theory is Wallerstein's world systems theory, or the dependency theory. This one we've also talked about. This one isn't so much as a game plan. Like Rostow's model gives you a way of developing. It gives you instructions. Wallerstein's world systems theory is a theory of development, but it does not give instructions on how to develop, because a core tenet of Wallerstein's world systems theory is that the world is the way it is, and that's how it's going to stay. there are core countries, there are semi-periphery countries, and there are periphery countries. And basically, the core uses the periphery and the semi-periphery for raw materials and manufactured goods so they can enjoy those things and sell them all around the world, or even sell them back to the semi-periphery and periphery. And the idea is too that the core chooses what countries will become the semi-periphery because they invest in those countries to make the consumer goods of the core. So it kind of a bleaker idea about the world and how the world is organized, and not so much hope for these developing nations, these peripheral nations. Now remember, core, periphery, semi-periphery doesn't mean core, these countries in the center, and periphery, those on the outside. This is a metaphor. So the countries that are core, that are the center, are the ones with money, and the periphery means that they don't have money. That's all. Now here's a breakdown of the world's core, semi-periphery, and periphery countries with a quick breakdown of the types of jobs that they have, what they do, and example countries. So I would take time, pause the video, look over it, and try to and have some of these known, just in your back pocket for the AP exam. Now, some more thoughts on Wallerstein's world systems theory and dependency theory. Countries can change. Unlike Rostow's, countries can move backwards, right? In Rostow's model, once they're in that stage, they're in that stage. But in Wallerstein's world systems theory, they can move backwards. The perfect example of this is the USSR, when the Soviet Union fell and Russia became a thing, and they went backwards in HDI. And once again, as I mentioned, not every country will develop, and it doesn't give instructions on how to develop. Now, remember that this can be applied at a country scale, this core periphery idea, but it can only be applied at periphery or semi-periphery countries where you have uneven development, where you have a core area that has lots of money, and then you have an underdeveloped region that doesn't. And we know that this is because of, most likely, colonialism. Wallerstein's world systems theory also fails to recognize the role of NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, basically organizations that, for example, maybe give out microloans to the developing world to try and help them develop. So those ideas could break Wallerstein's world systems theory. Now, Wallerstein's world systems theory and part of Rostow's comes from this idea of commodity dependence, that you are relying on one agricultural product or one type of product you're harvesting from the planet in this primary sector of employment, that then you are trading with the rest of the world, and your whole economy is linked to that commodity dependence, right? And we've seen this in banana republics where they just produce bananas, or we could talk about the Ivory Coast and them pumping out only chocolate and known for their chocolate, and basically propping up their whole economy on that. And then where do we see commodity dependence? Exactly where you would think, where we're harvesting these materials around the world. So then we get to our third economic model, which is the self-sufficiency model. And the first two have talked about other countries being involved. The self-sufficiency model, no other countries are involved. The goal is to cut your country off from trade with the rest of the world because you want to grow your entire economy at the same time together using the money and resources found inside of your country. Now, you can't just cut everybody off. You have to try and do that through high tariffs, complicated licenses, limiting goods, so on and so forth. And we've gone in depth in these, and you can see them in the notes too. Or you could look back at past videos on ideas on how to do that. But remember, there are problems with the self-sufficiency model. And the thing is, India is the best example of the self-sufficiency state, but even they didn't stick to it. They have switched now to more of a Rostow's model type of development, counting on international trade. Because when you go to the self-sufficiency model, the fact is the businesses in your country aren't going to try anymore because they don't have competition with the outside world. You need a large bureaucracy to monitor all these tariffs and permits, and then finally people are going to get what they want, and they're going to create a black market. Here's a Venn diagram that you could use to compare these three. So how does the development of a country affect its industry and where we live products? Well, we're talking about situation factors now. So remember, situation factors are how close are our inputs, where are our markets, and the cost of transportation. Now, why would we worry about this? Because we've talked about development, so now we need to figure out how we make this money in these places. So based on your situation factors, you're going to have different types of businesses, or how we label those businesses, right? How we label that manufacturing, that industry. And one of the first ways we do it is by bulk reducing. This idea that the raw materials weigh more than the outputs. But instead of weighing more, I like thinking of taking up space. So your inputs take up the space of 3 trucks, but your output is only 1 truck. So bulk reducing industries would be placed closer to inputs to minimize transportation costs. Because if you have to fill 3 trucks to make 1 truck, you don't want those 3 trucks driving 1,000 miles. You want them driving like 2 miles and have the 1 truck drive the long distance because it's just 1 truck instead of 3. Now, remember, our situation factors are how close are our inputs, where are our markets, and what are the transportation costs. So all bulk reducing industries are going to place themselves near their inputs, and they're going to manipulate those situation factors to keep the cost down. But remember, these are our situation factors. So let's say the reverse. What about if our outputs weigh more, our outputs take up more space? Well, then we're going to be closer to the market to reduce those transportation costs. And that manufacturing or that industry would be referred to as a bulk gaining industry. Now, of course, there is where you don't care about your inputs or outputs because maybe you don't have a physical thing that you're selling. So your situation factors don't matter. You could be placed anywhere. There's no transportation costs, so you are a footloose industry. Now, these situation factors are based on Weber's least cost theory. The idea, once again, looking at the location of raw materials, the location of customers, and transportation costs, we're going to figure out where in between the raw materials and customers to put our industry to maximize the amount of money that is made. And it's like von Thunen's model, but for industry. And of course, we got to talk about break of bulk points when we talk about transportation. And it's when goods are transported, they're often moved from one form of transportation to another. If you go from a truck to a boat to a train, each one of those is a break of bulk point. Now, this used to take forever in the past, unloading goods, putting it on a new form of transportation. But what has cut down drastically on break of bulk points are shipping containers, right? These big shipping containers that you can just take off of the boat, put it right onto the back of a truck, boom, it's on its way, or the back of a train, or whatever. And this leads me to bring up what is the most efficient, most cost efficient, or a cost-effective form of transportation, especially goods all around the world, would be these giant shipping containers on the back of boats. And now we switch to our site factors. So as in a capitalizing industrialist, we care about our transportation factors and where our inputs and outputs are, but we also have to worry about what is there, what land is there, what labor is there, and how it can help us. So land is based on 2 things, right? When businesses are looking at land, they are obviously looking at the cost of land, right? They know that closer to the city, it's going to be more expensive. Further out, it's going to be, in rural areas, it's going to be cheaper. But they're also looking at what infrastructure is there, right? We wonder what free stuff are we getting when, and they think, okay, are there roads there? Is electricity there? Are ports there? And lack of amenities, they're not going to want to go there. But that may be a good idea for maybe international corporations or multinational corporations who want to set up, a factory in a developing nation, and they go, okay, you don't have infrastructure here, but we can build it, and that could be part of the land cost and reducing land cost and so on and so forth. Labor, when you're looking for labor, you either are looking for skilled or low skilled. Skilled labor, you need educated people. These businesses are going to probably place themselves in MDCs in big cities near major universities to get these smart people. Low skilled work, stuff that you can train people on in a morning and then they do the job over and over and over again. We don't have to pay them a whole lot of money. These can be done anywhere. So they may try to locate in a place where there's just a population center, but maybe not skilled workers. Now, what we call low-skill jobs are Fordist jobs. It comes from exactly what you think it does. Ford, right, the car company, and these assembly lines. These are low-skill jobs that you can do over and over again, so you don't have to pay people a whole. Whereas post-Fordist jobs are high-skill jobs where you do need to pay people more because these jobs are tough. They have multiple skills tied to them, so you generally pay them more. Now we have labor-intensive industries. These are industries that are going to utilize the site factor of labor to get a lot of Fordist labor, low-skill labor, because a majority of their payroll or their budget is just paying people to make things. Think about textiles, clothing, right? All the people that make clothing is a labor-intensive industry in some developing nations, some far away. But remember, somehow having these workers in these labor intensive industries making a whole lot less money than in the developed world is still cheaper because, they can, it's still cheaper to produce these clothes in other countries and then ship it around the world on the back of these big boats instead of making it inside of developed nations. And then finally, capital. This is our last site factor. The fact is, you need money to start a business. If there isn't money to start a business, that you can't start a business. And loans are easy. Loans are easy to find in MDCs, but not so much in LDCs. And the last thing about capital, and this is probably the more important one, when places are trying to entice businesses or services to go to their city, they'll offer them tax breaks, right? And this is a great site factor for a business owner because no one likes paying taxes, especially business owners. So lower taxes means more money for you, and you would be more inclined to build your business there. Now, this idea of because we have these multinational companies using situation and site factors around the world, we have newly industrialized countries and international trade. Basically, an NIC is a high developing country that manufactures goods for the developed world, and we know that the developed world is taking advantage of the site and situation factors in these NICs to, have stuff made. And in these NICs, they generally have export processing zones, a physical space with special regulations to benefit foreign controlled businesses. So let's say Nike, for example, builds a factory in Guangdong, China, where, it's on a port, it's near the coast, and, that is a special export processing zone where Nike gets tax breaks. They can use the situation factors and the site factors right there, so on and so forth. And because of all this, all these export processing zones, all of these factories being built in these countries, they become high developing countries, or NICs, newly industrialized countries. Now, what they make with these export processing zones are also special economic zones or free trade zones. So you can see these interchangeably: export processing zone, special economic zone, or free trade zone. Which then brings us to an example of these EPZs, or places or of newly industrialized countries. Let's talk about Mexico and the maquiladoras. So these are American-owned factories on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border. The reason for this? Well, situation factor. You're right next to the United States, so you're cutting your situation factor, that transportation cost, as low as you can. And then we talk about site factors. They have free trade due to NAFTA or the USMCA. There's no tariffs. There's no taxes in that zone. They have low wages available in Mexico, plenty of people willing to work for lower wages instead of Americans. And they have relaxed environmental regulations, which means even cheaper for businesses to run. They have cheap land there. They have the amenities there for these factories to be built. So this is a perfect space for multinational corporations to set up an EPZ to help Mexico become an NIC. Right, and here's just some pictures of, these maquiladoras and the process of how it works, right? And then here we see Mexico is the top source for U.S. car imports. So just getting an idea that Mexico pumps out a ton of products for the United States. And here is a global, the new International Division of Labor. So now we're taking this a step further and not looking at just the newly industrialized country like Mexico and then its key part, the maquiladoras. We're looking at the grand scale of things, how everybody is tied together. So this idea that transnational corporations have multiple offices or multiple parts of their business across the world to take advantage of all the site factors. So we know the new International Division of Labor basically states that the low-skill, low-wage Fortis jobs are done in the developing world, while the high-skill, high-wage post-Fortis jobs are done in the developed world. But we can break this down even further with sectors of employment that the predominantly tertiary jobs and up are in the developed world, and predominantly secondary and primary in the developing world. Now we know tertiary and upper are LDCs, and we know secondary and primary and MDCs, but for the most part, these are the jobs that we have respectively in our countries because of that new International Division of Labor. And once again, looking at it, we know that this process, this International Division of Labor looking at batteries, the process starts in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is a country in Central Africa. It's the only place with precious materials used for batteries. So then it gets shipped over to China. And in China, that's where they'll make the batteries. And from there, they ship it to the developed regions of the world, which will then sell the finished product. Now, once again, these newly industrialized countries, the ones making these batteries, the ones that are doing the manufacturing, these semi-periphery nations, are doing well in this international division of labor. They're making more money and they are developing, right? Rostow's model is really kicking in here. And what you got to know are BRICS and Mint. These are the countries, these newly industrialized countries, that are on their way to becoming developed nations. And once again, they do this through export processing zones where they can utilize money from foreign nations to ship out stuff, to be an export oriented economy, but move into secondary sectors of employment, and then hopefully onto tertiary and so on and so forth. And once again, just seeing EPZs, SEZs, FTZs, stuff we've already seen. How can we apply Rostow's and Wallerstein's theory to IDL? Well, stages 2 and 3 countries are doing the raw material factory work, while stage 4 and 5 countries do the high level work. Or you could say countries in the periphery harvest the resources, semi-periphery countries produce the products, and core countries consume the products. The idea is to bring as much of this together as we can. And now let's move on to services, right? So we've talked about industry and we've talked about how countries make money through this international division of labor, but now let's look at the services part of the international division of labor, looking what happens in the developed world, selling these manufactured goods, looking at these tertiary sector jobs. So a couple terms we have to understand when we're talking about services. One, the multiplier effect, this idea that jobs create more jobs. If, Amazon, we talked a lot about Amazon and we talked about moving their headquarters. If they put their headquarters in a place, other jobs will accumulate around it. But the same is with, in reverse, as we deindustrialize, other businesses leave because we deindustrialize, the factories leave, people lose jobs when people don't have money because they lost jobs. They can't go spend their money in surrounding services, so those jobs also leave. And this ties to, we saw this with suburbanization and, white flight and all that, but we won't get into that. Agglomeration is businesses grouping up together to minimize site and situation costs, mainly in the secondary sector. And then finally, technopoles, an agglomeration of information-based industry or high-tech manufacturing. This takes advantage in similar site factors and surrounding services and can also be considered growth poles. You also see the multiplier effect from these because think of Silicon Valley as a technopole, right? You have all of that happening out there, the designing, the manufacturing, and of course, they have to build services around that for those people, restaurants, housing, stuff for people to do, so on and so forth. Now, if we break down our services, we know that first we have consumer services. Basically, they are selling. Business services, these are the services that help other services work. Public services, these are services provided by the government for the protection of citizens and businesses. So not just government jobs, but government jobs that also provide security and protection. We have to know, looking back here, what we have to know from this is that in the developing world, more and more of our jobs are involved in services. That's the main thing to take from this, that we're really stepping away from primary and secondary employment. So now let's talk about central place and market areas, right? Because when we talk about services, we have to talk about the market area of those services. So first off, what the heck is central place? Central place is the center. It is where that business is, and its functional region around it is its market area or its hinterland. And it's this area that basically the people in that area will shop at that business or use that service. And people are in one market area of a service or in another market area. So the market area of these places is determined by range and threshold. Range is the distance people will drive, while threshold is the people it takes to support that business. Now, it's not always cut and dry on sizes of market areas based on range and threshold, but for the most part, we can determine the market area based on these things. Now, as I stated earlier, no market areas will ever overlap. You're either in one or the other. And what I mean by that, though, is with a similar service. So when we're looking at, say, a service of Walgreens, you're either going to go to one Walgreens or the other. You don't go to both or somehow split yourself. You're choosing which one to go to. So market areas cannot overlap. Now, they could overlap if it's, say, Walgreens and a Publix, but those are two different services. So no market areas of the same service will ever overlap. And once again, they're based on range and threshold. So when we look at these market areas, We see, though, that some market areas are really small and some are really big. But remember, it's based on threshold and range. And when we're looking at this map, we see this map of downtown Tampa where Walgreens threshold, let's say, is 500 customers a day. It's probably not a lot. It's a small store, right? And people aren't willing to drive a long distance to get to a Walgreens. So that's why we have so many in downtown Tampa, because you have so many people there that aren't willing to drive far, but they can meet their threshold because there's so many people there. But that green market area, that's far out from downtown. The threshold hasn't changed, but the market area is bigger because there's just less people out there. So they still got to meet that same threshold, but they serve a wider area just because there's just less people. So the range also increases. Now, the general rule with businesses is a bigger the business is, the larger range it will have and the higher threshold it will have, so the larger the market area will be. And smaller businesses have smaller ranges and lower thresholds, so they'll generally have smaller market areas. Now, this is the general pattern. What messes this up is specialty services. Specialty services could have a low threshold but have a really high range because of it's such a specialized service that people might need, like say a piano tuner or something like that, where you will drive a long way for that specialty service. And this idea of a central place theory, we can see it when we look at the map of the United States and we're looking at it lit up, and we're looking at this concept of airports where they are in those most lit up areas, that they will have this very large range and threshold and they cover the entire United States because we got to go to one airport or another. So this is looking at a service that extends, the entire US. So here's a quick recap. Go ahead and pause it if you need to see it. And then we get to the idea that what if not individual services have market areas, but what if entire cities and towns could have market areas? And this guy Chrysler came up with this idea that entire cities, the accumulation of all of their services, will create market areas. But then he took it a step further and then labeled the services and then gave each of those sets of services market areas. So let's look at this confusing